Hello, my name is Anna Black. I am an associate for the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the Legal Network for Gender Equity.
Hello, my name is Sky Staley, and I am the program manager for the Times Up Legal Defense Fund and Legal Network for Gender Equity.
Working with survivors of sexual harassment, assault, and abuse to take steps in their healing processes can be a rewarding experience both for professionals providing resources and the survivors themselves. But there's a reason that not everyone can do this kind of work. Creating and maintaining a safe space for the survivor that you're working with and takes a lot of care and patience and requires an understanding of trauma responses. Now, before we go on, I do want to note that no presentation can make you an expert. We are instead providing you with this information as an introduction to trauma-informed work and encourage you to continue learning beyond this presentation. For today, we will discuss what trauma-informed work looks like, how to apply it to your practice, and how a survivor's trauma might show up when speaking to them. Now, first, let's review how we work. Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is housed at and administered by the National Women's Law Center Fund. The National Women's Law Center is an almost 50-year-old gender justice organization that has been at the forefront of the major changes for women's rights for decades. About 4 years ago, NWLC started the Legal Network for Gender Equity to help people facing sex discrimination in the workplace, in education, and in healthcare connect with attorneys and the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund to help fund selected cases of workplace sexual harassment and to provide media assistance for selected cases of workplace sexual harassment.
So there are four major buckets to the work that we do. The first one is connecting workers with legal resources. The second is funding legal costs and fees. The third is offering media assistance and storytelling assistance. And the fourth is funding community outreach. For our first bucket, we connect people enduring workplace sex harassment and retaliation for attorneys in our network. Attorneys agree to do the initial consultation with a worker coming through us for free. During that consultation, the attorney lays out the possible legal options. And depending on the outcome of those conversations, the individual can hire the attorney. Should also note that we do provide individuals with 3 attorneys to have that conversation with. Since January 2018, we actually have responded to over 8,600 requests for help, and we currently have over 400 attorneys in our network. Our focus is primarily on low-wage workers, and approximately 2/3 of the people who request legal help from us identify as low income. 1/3 of them are people of color. We provide funding for the costs and attorney fees for cases involving workplace sex harassment and related retaliation. More specifically, attorneys apply for funding for cases involving workplace sex harassment. Since March 2018, we have funded over 300 cases. Again, our focus is low-wage workers. We fund cases about farm workers, restaurant workers, fast food workers, retail workers. We funded cases about women in heavily male professions like construction, police departments, and paramedics. We've also funded cases involving intersecting forms of discrimination. For example, cases involving both sex harassment and discriminations on the basis of disability, and cases involving discrimination based on the person's sex, race, or ethnicity. For our third bucket, some people do reach out to us and they don't want a lawsuit. They just want to tell us what happened to them. Others have received inquiries from the press and want to know how to respond. And still others have filed lawsuits and are facing serious backlash in the press. To help all of these people, we work with professional public relations firms to help them prepare to talk to the press, find outlets to speak with, and respond to press inquiries. Since 2018, we have provided media assistance for over 130 cases.
So now that we've broken that down, why is trauma-informed work important, and what is trauma-informed work? So trauma-informed work is a way of providing care to individuals that have experienced deeply distressing or disturbing experiences, and they may follow 5 principles of safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And why is this work important? The people who you will be helping through Time's Up Legal Defense Fund have often been through traumatic experiences. They've been harassed and may have been assaulted. Many of them have lost their jobs. When they came forward, their employers may not have been supportive of them and in some cases may have blamed them. Family members and friends may have done the same thing. Asking for assistance after receiving harm, be it physical, psychological, or both, vulnerable and can be scary. It's important that we as professionals do all that we can to ensure that the survivors that contact us know that we believe them, we hear them, and we want to help.
So there are guiding principles in trauma-informed work and care that serve as a framework to prevent the likelihood of re-traumatization. The principles are listed here, and it's safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. While there are different ways to interpret and apply these principles based on the type of service someone may be providing, what is always consistent in ensuring that the physical and emotional safety of an individual is being prioritized. An example of safety is creating a physically welcoming atmosphere, a warm greeting, and a recognition of discomfort or fear. Since we, are still in the Zoom world, you can use other gestures like having your camera on, smiling when necessary, starting the meeting with a warm greeting, and also allowing pauses in the conversation to happen. Choice is about letting individuals know what their rights are up front, allowing individuals to take breaks while they're telling their story, as an example. While we recognize that there are deadlines and that there is an essential need to gather as much details as possible, individuals should be able to provide information in a way that prioritizes their sense of autonomy and their sense of safety. The third principle is collaboration. Collaboration requires that individuals take an active part in decision-making. You work with them in a team to help determine next steps. If an individual does not feel comfortable allowing certain details to be in the public, for fear of their physical and emotional safety, it's important to honor their choice and their needs. Trustworthiness, which is the fourth principle, appears in each principle. In order to collaborate effectively, it is important to maintain respectful and professional boundaries. This should go without saying, but we never want to judge an individual for what they did and didn't do in a situation. We also want to make sure that there is clarity to their expectations and limitations around an individual's case or story. This also means following through. If you are saying that you're going to do something like giving a call or emailing them at a certain time, you should do it. It builds trust. Finally, empowering a client means that you're providing an environment where the individual feels validated, affirmed, and emotionally supported. Although this isn't necessarily your role, focusing on an individual's strength and validating their experience can help them to develop their strong coping skills and find a sense of healing by sharing their story.
The people that you'll be working with have decided they want to speak publicly about what has happened to them. Sometimes that's because they want to stop it from happening to other people. Sometimes it's because talking publicly is a step in how they get through their traumatic experience. And other times they just don't have a choice. The press wants to talk to them. If you're working to guide them through this process, they might see you as someone that they can trust and can turn to if they have questions or they're feeling overwhelmed. It's important in those moments to respond in a way that makes them feel safe and seen. This can also help to de-escalate tension and recenter the conversation if it's lost focus. So to recap, a traumatic event can negatively affect someone's life in many ways. Many people experience barriers to receiving care or may have had a negative or even violent experience when seeking help. Trauma-informed care seeks to instill feelings of hope and empowerment in survivors and helps to equip survivors with tools for healing so they're in charge of their healing process. So in your first meeting with someone, here's some things to think about for the first meeting. First, triggers. Triggers, be prepared to pause the conversation if the survivor seems to have been triggered by something. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about each of these in the following slides. Also, focus points. A survivor may sometimes talk cyclically. Having a gentle segue prepared, such as, I hear you, it sounds like this is part of your experience and it's really affected you. I want to be mindful of the time that we have today. So would it be all right if we went to, XYZ topic? Or another example of that could be, I imagine that this must have been difficult. Can you tell me what happened next? This can help to kind of keep the conversation focused. Goals for storytelling are an important part also, so that you can kind of help to manage expectations. What, based on the facts of the case, do you think is the focus of the story? What does the survivor want from sharing in the press? And what questions do you want answered in this story? Just be prepared to be flexible. Another option is to provide the potential clients the opportunity to meet with the attorney first, so that you have an idea of what the attorney has already spoken about with the client. It's important to, when possible, get the permission of the client to do this to ensure that they don't ever feel left out of the process. But it can be helpful to talk to the attorney before meeting with the client, just to get some background information as well. I want to note that this is meant primarily for the first meeting that you have, but it may also be a good idea to check in with the survivor after the first session to see what they may need within reason to feel more comfortable getting through the interview next time. So some of the points that Skye mentioned earlier were trustworthiness, choice, and safety. A couple more examples of ways that you can set that up in the first meeting is thanking them for being willing to share their story with you. That's a big deal. A lot of people have a difficult time sharing their story with a lot of people, and the fact that they're sharing it with you may mean a lot to them. So you want to acknowledge that and thank them for that. And just acknowledge that also their trust means a lot to you. It may also be good to set up that sometimes questions may be difficult to answer and may have a connotation that feels uncomfortable to them. So letting them know that it's okay to take a break and to take frequent breaks if necessary may be a good way to set up following conversations. So for the example that I've written here is, I want you to know that I might ask you some questions that may be difficult to answer. If at any point you need to take a break or need to skip the question, please tell me. It is totally okay. It may also be helpful to send your client questions ahead of time. Now, since we're on the topic of trust, I want to talk about that for 1 minute. Excuse me. It can be hard to rebuild trust with someone as a survivor who has felt betrayed by someone close to them before. You likely won't know the survivor at all before meeting with them, so it's important to start building that trust from the moment that you meet them. Some simple ways that you can earn that trust is living up to promises. So for example, if you say that you're going to call them at 3 p.m., make sure that you do that and you stick to that. And of course, life happens. So if there's a change of plan, communicate that with them. Consistent and honest communication is invaluable. Now, there are some difficulties in getting the story ready for the press. Linear story is one of them. We've touched a little bit on that, but we'll go a little bit further into that. Details of the story, and then getting the survivor comfortable with questions. Some of the people that you're working with will not have told the whole story to anyone. Some have told their story many times. Either way, you may see that they don't tell it chronologically or that they add details that you don't necessarily see the importance of to the story. Part of what you will be doing is getting them ready to talk to press and working with them to create a narrative that the reporter can follow and that hits the important themes of the story. When you are doing this, you must be aware that what you and the reporter see as important, the survivor might not. Also, reporters are often interested in the most salacious facts, which might be the hardest ones for the survivor to share. Finally, you should get the survivor comfortable with answering questions, and even hard ones. This is all work that you as PR people do every day. In this situation, it's important to do it in a trauma-informed way by, for example, explaining that these are questions that the reporter may have and that in asking them, you are not trying to say that you don't believe the survivor. And then here are, again, some difficulties in speaking with a survivor about their experience. So we'll start with triggers, flashbacks, anger, and projection, and needing frequent breaks.
So just to provide a definition, a trigger is any event or object that reminds you of or subconsciously connects you to a traumatic experience in your life. Triggers can actually come in the form of words. They can come in the form of images and sounds and smells, and it can literally all happen at once for some folks. Triggers do affect individuals differently, so it's important to be attentive to an individual's demeanor, especially when they're getting to the facts of their story. You may want to ask the survivor if they're okay with you speaking with their attorney before you meet, and you should always be transparent with them. If you ask this, let them know why you want to speak with their attorney, and you should want to find out the basic facts, know where the case is, so that you don't have to go through that again with the survivor.
Flashbacks are another common trauma response. Some indicators of a flashback might be verbal cues. So they might start speaking about the assault in the present tense, where they may have been saying, you know, when he did this or when they did this. Instead, they'll start saying he is pushing or they are pushing me. This is happening. I can feel this XYZ happening right now. So that may be a verbal cue. Also speaking in circles, if they keep coming back to the same topic or the same point many over and over, and it seems that it continues to always land in that same space, that may be also an indicator of a flashback. Some visual cues, most of these, because we are, as Sky mentioned before, we are still living in a Zoom world. Often you may not see the survivor, but if you are on a Zoom call or you are, in whatever occasion you are in person with them, some visual cues may include them appearing zoned out or unfocused. You might notice that they have a change in their breathing pattern. This can also sometimes be detected on a call where you don't see the survivor. You may hear them breathing faster or even hyperventilating. But you might notice that breathing pattern a little bit better in person because you'll physically be able to see their body move. They may also become physically tense. So they might have tensed fists or their posture will become very rigid. So these are some things to kind of look out for flashbacks. And then the next slide, we talk a little bit about what helps during a flashback. We want to, before we go into this, just emphasize that we don't encourage you to use any of these practices. These are tools that mental health professionals might use sometimes for individuals that experience flashbacks and PTSD. We have included it here for your awareness, just so that you know that these might be some things that you see, because survivors may use these coping mechanisms outside of their practice with their mental health professional. So, for example, grounding is a big one for individuals with flashbacks. The 5 senses technique is possibly the most well-known of these. That includes naming one of each things that you can see, smell, taste, hear, and touch. So some people may use an ice cube or may ask for an ice cube. They may use essential oils that have a really strong scent. The sense of smell is one of the strongest in bringing us back from a flashback or a triggered PTSD. Sour candy, anything with a strong physical kind of presence that touches, that affects your senses, is usually used for grounding techniques like that. So all of those can be helpful in bringing the person back to the present. Breathing exercises, they may, as I said in the previous slide, that their breathing may change. They may recognize that and try to bring themselves down by, counting and breathing. They may start with, like a deep breath in and then count back down for a number of counts. So they may do that on their own, or they may have done that before with a mental health professional or a therapist of some kind. If you see that this is happening, allow space and give them a break if it's clear that they need it. It is totally okay to let them know that, that this is sometimes necessary and that you understand that they're having a hard time. So just affirm that they're doing a good job of telling you this story, that you understand that, that this is difficult for them and that they can take a break if they need it. We've also highlighted here affirmation, validation, and talking to their attorney before the interview. Sometimes the attorney may know that they have certain triggers, or there are certain things that may bring them into a flashback, or even that they have flashbacks to begin with. So it can be kind of helpful to know that ahead of time to prepare you for that. Another one that we see sometimes is anger and projection. Anger is a very normal part of someone's healing process. Often it is, you may feel that anger is directed towards you when you're speaking with a survivor. That often is the survivors, that's a way of coping. They may be more angry at their situation than they actually are at you. But nonetheless, receiving anger from someone you're trying to help can be frustrating. It's a very normal reaction from a survivor, especially when someone is asking questions, requiring details, or like making them go back to the same facts again and again. It can be a really exhausting process for both the person that is trying to help and also the survivor. So if the conversation starts to become tense and you feel like there's anger directed at you, don't panic. It's really easy to take this personally, but give yourself a moment if you need to, and then set your boundaries. It's okay to set them. And one way that you might do that is saying, I'm hearing that you're in a lot of pain right now. Can we take a second to breathe before we continue? That might be a soft way. If it continues to escalate, for example, if they begin to curse at you or they're yelling at you or cutting you off a lot, that might be time to set a stronger boundary and just let them know that you understand how difficult this is and that you really want to hear what they have to say. But that, so that your conversation can continue, you have to ask that they don't speak to you that way. Also, taking breaks is important for you and the survivor that you're speaking with. It takes a lot of energy to talk about and listen to situations that have caused someone trauma. Just remember that you can't pour from an empty cup. One way to set breaks is creating a signal at the beginning of your conversation that lets you both know that you need a second to breathe or to talk about something else. So the example I've included here is a physical signal like a thumbs up or a thumbs down that indicates that thumbs up means I'm doing okay, I'm doing well, or a thumbs down might signify that I need to take a break. Can we pause for a second? It's also okay to check in, ask if they're doing okay. If this is happening over Zoom or in person, or that helps if you can see each other. But if you can't see each other, if you're on a call, let's say, and you can't see each other, it may be better to set a verbal cue. You can even say something as simple as, hey, I'd like to stop, or can we put a pause in this for a second and take a second to breathe. Active listening is a major one that it's no longer things that you should expect from an interview, but rather things that you should probably try to have in your practice. Active listening is major when you're speaking to a survivor. You want to make sure that they know that you're listening, not just for the story, but that you're also listening for them. Things like repeat backs can be a good way to show that you are listening and that you are taking great care in their story and what they are saying. For example, you could say, you mentioned XYZ a moment ago. What can you tell me about that? Or it sounds like things were really difficult after this thing that they mentioned. When you're asking questions, consider your tone and the tone of the question. You might have some questions that seem innocent in nature, but could come across as victim shaming. For example, you might want to ask them something like, why didn't you leave your job? To understand what factors made leaving their situation difficult. But that question might sound like you're implying that what happened to them was their fault because they could have left. In that example, you might instead say something like, I can imagine that working through this experience was not easy. Can I ask what made it difficult to leave? That sort of acknowledges the hardship of their situation and shifts the blame from the survivor to the workplace. Sound cues while you're listening to them are important, just to make sure, especially if you're on the phone, if you don't see each other, they might sometimes want to know that you're still listening and that you're still there, especially if they've been talking for a long time, or if there's a pause while you're trying to figure out if they have finished saying their piece or want to move on. So things like, I see, or I hear you, or yes, I'm listening, can be good ways to just signify to them that you are still there, you are still present, that you're listening. I talked a little bit about tone a second ago, but pauses are also important. Pauses can be a really great tool in journalism, but a pause isn't always a green light to move on to the next question or comment. So if it sounds like there's been a little bit of space, it may be good to give that space before trying to move on to the next piece, because they may be trying to recollect some of their memories or figure out the best way to talk about what they've experienced. Mirroring language is another one I'll pause on for a second. This is kind of a silly example here. If they say blue, use blue, don't substitute with cerulean. What I'm trying to say is don't try to change their words. They may have already had their narrative, sort of changed for them. And you want to make sure that they feel like their narrative is their own. So a more kind of specific example to this kind of situation is if they say the harasser kept talking about what I was wearing and how cute I looked, and then you discuss this later and you refer it as he was admiring you. That switch in language minimizes the experience of the survivor. You want to make sure that you're using the same kind of language or a type of language that holds the same kind of weight as what they've said. So in that instance, you might, instead of saying, he was admiring you, just say, so it sounds like the harasser was talking about you or making comments that made you uncomfortable. Try not to infer too much from what they're saying and just mirroring instead.
So after taking into consideration everything that Anna has laid out here, we really want you all to think about what happens after this initial meeting. And two things we've identified is that you should always thank the survivor for sharing their stories with you. Again, just to reiterate, it is not easy for folks to share personal and traumatic experiences. So we just want to acknowledge that it's very difficult to talk about and thank them for sharing themselves with us and their time. Something else that is very important is that we want to set expectations for the next steps. You should definitely let survivors know what they should expect and offer to answer whatever questions they may have at the end. Again, you are working on their team, so it's very important for a survivor to feel like they are being informed of what next steps are and what their choices are in this process as well. So for the next slide, we also want to recognize that it's important to know your limitations as well. And it's very important to place boundaries while still being affirming and respectful. So the first thing we have here is considering time. While it's important to provide time for survivors to share their story, you also want to set up a realistic expectation of how long the meeting will and can be. So, as an example, do you have capacity to maybe go on a 3-hour interview? That's something for you to consider, and that's something for your team to consider as well. And even the consideration of the survivor. Does it look healthy to have someone talk about these personal and possible traumatic experiences for that long? Again, we also want to set expectations. Consider stating your role and your intentions and how you will participate in the process of telling the survivor story at the beginning of the interview. And you should also reiterate it at the end. Privacy is another thing. We would personally say do not give your personal contact information unless you are comfortable doing so. Recognize that some folks, with, of course, giving your private, or personal contact information, maybe contacting you on off hours or times where you rest. So you want to take into consideration what that looks like for you when you're not working or when you're prioritizing your personal time. For communication, you should always provide updates, follow-ups, and that communication should be directed to both the attorney and the survivor. so that everyone is on the same page and has the same information. And we also want to state that you should not be giving advice or suggestions that are related to therapeutic services, healing modalities, or bringing up therapeutic frameworks that you may be familiar with. Again, as your role in doing this work, we just want to make sure that folks are not confusing your position as a PR individual, and know that there are trained professionals that can provide them with therapeutic services or healing modalities separate from telling their stories. Last but not least, it's really important to take care of yourself. So make sure to take breaks between interviews, set up time blocks to, take time for yourself, whether that means going, on a walk, grabbing your favorite drink, meditating, especially if the interview was triggering or upsetting. If you do have multiple interviews going back to back with survivors, you may carry that energy from, one interview to another. So you just want to be mindful of, how to, of course, set up time for you to rest, and set up, intentional time to make sure you're prioritizing the needs of individual coming to you as well. We really do want to reiterate that, this PowerPoint does not make anyone an expert in trauma-informed work, but we do hope that this was helpful and want to encourage you to continue learning about this topic. So we just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for joining us. And of course, we have a link to the additional resources, but we can always send that with an email and with our personal email address, not our personal email addresses, talking about boundaries, with our NWC email addresses if there are any questions that come up after watching this. So thank you.